Hi, this is part 13 in my God tier landscapes tutorial series. And in the last session, we had a look at how we could set up the biomes and kind of like layer weights distribution inside of Houdini, which was kind of building on some previous work we did in Houdini earlier on in the series. And today what we're going to be doing is we're going to take those weight maps into Unreal and we're going to replace what you see before you with those weights. We're also going to bring in the textures that we created in another video earlier in the series. So these are textures we created from satellite photos and aerial photography. And we're going to bring those satellite photos and aerial photography together with the weights that we created in the last session. And we're going to end up with a result that's going to look something like this. Without any further ado, let's just jump straight in there. I'm going to hop over to the scene we're going to be working in. And what we're going to do is, to get started, we really just want to be considering the terrain in its most kind of like macro sense. We don't really want to be like worrying too much about all the details, all the grass. So before I do anything else, I'm going to click on the landscape itself, and I'm going to jump inside of the material instance. You can see we've got all of these layers set up here already, and that's all fine for the time being. What we're really interested in is the layer itself. So we're going to open up one of the layers. It doesn't matter which one because they all share the same material layer that we created earlier. And I'm going to go inside of here, and you see we've got this kind of function that's a little bit messy. And the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to disconnect the grass setup for the time being, because that's just going to cloud our judgment when we're considering the terrain in the macro sense. And you can see we've got this detail color, and we've also got this macro color. And we just want to take the macro color. We want to get the texture sample that doesn't have any MIP bias applied to it. And we're just going to plug that directly into the base color. Actually, let's plug it into the tint. So now we're just taking a single macro color texture. We have the option of tinting it, and that's going into the base color there. And we do also have the macro normal, which optionally you can blend with a detail normal. But if you have blended it with a detail normal, we also want to kind of pull that off to the side. So we're just left with the macro normal plugged in and the macro color. And that's going to simplify our workflow when we're trying to just work on the macro textures and set those up. So let's go ahead and apply those changes. Once those changes have been applied, come back into our landscape, you're going to see that it looks a little bit different. And the reason it looks a little different is because we're no longer seeing the detailed textures getting blended into the macro textures. And already you can kind of see that there's a lot less noise in the image that we'll be able to deal with it a little bit more cleanly. And if we fly out and have a little look at it in a macro sense, maybe press Alt-3 on the keyboard to switch to base color view mode rather than lit, you can see we've got some weight maps which just came back from like the second video in the series, which were a little bit kind of like basic, a little bit naive. And we've just spent a lot of time trying to work on this so that we have like much more kind of interesting and very varied splat maps. So if we hop over into Houdini, you remember we set up in the last video all of these layer exports to be bound to a single null node, which has a bake all button. So we're just going to hit that bake all button. There you go. And that's going to actually output these all on disk. So I'm just going to select one of these layers, and I'm going to go over to where it says file name, and we're just going to go over to that little icon on the far right, and we're going to go up to where it says look in and hit expand path. I'm going to select the path and copy it, and then we're going to go to Windows Explorer and paste that path in there. And you're going to see that we have all of those layers exported. Now, it's probably going to take you a moment for those layers to be exported because it's going to have to bake quite a lot of textures. But I've got my terrain layer dirt here, which is kind of the sediment, the highlands grass, which isn't something I ran through the tutorial. That's something I did by myself. And we've got the wetland, gravel, heath, and rock. So today we're just going to be worrying about the dirt, the heath, the gravel, and the rock. These are just kind of bonus layers that I've done in my own time. So if we switch back over to Unreal, we're going to go and press Shift-2 on the keyboard to switch to the landscape editing mode. And we're going to go to the Paint tab and take a quick little look at the layers we've got there. And you can see that we've got a grass, a rock, and a sediment layer already set up. But we need to add a heath layer and a gravel layer. So to do that, we need to go back into our material instance. And we're going to go to the Details tab. And then we're going to open up the landscape, the master material there. And you can see we've got this kind of grass logic down here, which I'm just going to kind of put to the side for now because we're not really worried about that. And over on the left of the disk material is where we're kind of setting up our layers, our weights that are driving the layer blend. So the layer blending is happening in this landscape layers, material attributes layers node there. So we know that we want to add heath and gravel. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this make float 2, plug that output into the customized UV3 there. And then I'm just going to copy both of these samples, and I'm going to rename this one to gravel, and I'm going to rename this one to heather. I'm going to spell it correctly as well. All right, now, if you're unfamiliar with this way of setting up layers where we're passing them through the customized UVs, I'd recommend you go back and check out an earlier part of this tutorial series, because what we're doing here is we're kind of abusing the way that the material editor works in order to create a much more simplified and easy to understand setup for landscape materials. So if you're unfamiliar with this way of doing things, you'll need to go back and check out an earlier part of this series. Now that I've set these up inside of the weight map inputs there, I'm just going to go ahead and hit apply, and I'm actually going to go ahead and hit save too. There's no reason for me to press apply and then save. It's just a weird habit I've gotten myself into. And you'll see now, if we go back into the 3D viewport, press Shift 2 to go back to the landscape editing mode. We don't actually have those layers yet. So this isn't anything to worry about. Quite simply, all we need to do is just disconnect the landscape material from the landscape material slot in the landscape. But before I do that, I'm going to hit Browse to there, and I'm going to close up this little weird content browser I have up there. And you're going to see that when I browse to it, it's going to find that material instance in the content browser. So when I disconnect it by hitting the little yellow icon to revert to default, now I can just very simply hit that apply button there because I've already got the landscape selected. And you'll see now we've got the exact same landscape appearance that we had before. Only this time we've got those additional layers. So it's just one of those kind of peculiarities of Unreal 4. Maybe they've fixed it in Unreal 5. So I'm going to go to where it says gravel. And you can see I've already got a gravel layer info here because I've made a whole prototype scene. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add another layer. But I'm going to do it slightly differently this time. If you have a look at this grass, rock, and sediment layer, you're going to see that they, well, you're not going to see anything special, particularly special about them. And the reason that we don't see any little kind of text on them is because we created weight blended layers. That's a normal layer. Now, I actually want some of these layers to be non-weight blended. I'm going to go into the reasons behind that very shortly. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and hit non-weight blended. The default location is fine. And you see now, because it's a non-weight blended layer, it says no weight blend. And I'm going to go ahead and do non-weight blended layer for the header too. And actually, I think that I want to set the rock and the sediment to also be non-weight blended. So in order to do that, I need to go and hit this little browse to. That's going to find where the layer is. I'm going to double click the layer. And you're going to see that inside of that layer now we have the option to set physical material. That is going to kind of allow us to affect audio and things like that. Hardness, that's how hard is the transition. And a bunch of other settings, but the one that I'm interested in is this no weight blend. So we're just going to turn that off. Sorry, we're going to turn that on, and you'll see now that's updated in the landscape panel too. I'm going to do the same for the sediment too. I'm going to put no weight blend there. So I can now save those both up, and close. Just going to close all of this down so we've got a slightly cleaner view for the time being. And we're going to discuss for a moment what is a non-weight blended layer. So the default behavior of landscape layers, sort of weight layers in Unreal, is that they are weight blended. And what does that mean? Well, that means that when you have one layer, let's go into Paint and kind of illustrate this hopefully a little bit more clearly. So if, for example, we paint a layer and we say this is the dirt that's getting painted now, when you go in and paint with rock, what it's actually doing is it's erasing the layer underneath it. So, so effectively, the blue kind of cuts through, erases, and paints that layer. So you can only have one layer occupying a position on the landscape. Now, this is great, and it's an optimization, and it kind of is a nice workflow thing to have if you want to have predictable behavior where whenever you paint a layer, it will erase a previous layer. But when you start wanting to make more complex effects on your terrains, like, for example, having blends between rock and grass and to have really interesting kind of overlaps there, what you really want to be doing is using non-weight blended layers. And that means that both the grass layer and the rock layer are both going to be able to occupy the same position. And whichever layer is drawn on top is going to be the one that's going to render. All right, so that's an explanation. And let's see what that does in practice. So, and why it's useful. So the grass layer, for the time being, because it's a non-weight blended layer, if we go up with this landscape editing mode open to where it says perspective, not perspective, sorry. If we go up to where it says base color, and you're going to see that there's this little heading called landscape. So if we click that and go to visualizers and hit layer debug, you're going to see now on the left over here in the landscape panel, we have this RG and B kind of option. So I'm going to hit R on the grass, G on the rock, and B on the sediment there. And I need to make sure that I'm not set on base color view mode. So I'm going back to lit. And you're going to see that that looks a little bit like the little paint diagram where we have our different colors representing different layers. And if I turn off the rock and the sediment, you're going to see that the grass layer has kind of been erased. Where it's black, that's where the other layers have come in and overwritten it. Now, that's not what I want as my base. I actually want the grass to be everywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just right-click that grass layer, and I'm going to hit Fill Layer. And there you see we've now got grass everywhere on the landscape. And because the layers were previously all weight blended layers, they have now they occupy significantly less. But they're not completely gone. And that's because these layers have been set to non-weight blended. So just have a quick little look. What you can see is that the rock hasn't actually been erased. It's still there. So that's kind of useful. That's one of the benefits of using non-weight. Non-weight blended layers. But that map of the rock is the old map. So now we just want to bring in our new maps again. So when I'm quickly switching between the landscape view mode and the regular view mode, by the way, that's Shift 2 and Shift 1. So Shift 1 comes back to non-landscape editing. Shift 2 is landscape. And Shift 3 is foliage. So you can look into what all of the Shift commands do. They're quite nice ways of navigating in the Unreal interface. And I'm just going to go to the rock, and I'm going to go import from file. And we're going to bring in the terrain layer rock there. So this is the new rock. And we're just going to do the same with each of these other layers too. So all right, and that's all of the layers imported. So if I press Shift 1 to leave the landscape editing mode, I'm just going to full screen with F11. We don't really see all of the layers. Like, we can see the rock is being placed in a couple of places, but we're not getting any of those other layers. So why is that? Well, there's a simple reason, and the reason is that we haven't actually set up and defined those layers in our material instance. At least we haven't set up and defined all of them. So you can see that previously we had an extra couple of layers called slopes in layer 5, and we're just gonna kill those. So I'm gonna go over to the right up here and hit clear path, and clear path again. And now this is where we're going to start adding in more of the layers to our landscape material. And something important to consider here now is that the order of these layers when using non-weight blended layers is actually important. So the top layer on the stack here is going to always render on top. So this is something you need to think about when you're importing these layers and setting them up in Houdini, is that the layer order in the material instance when you're using layered landscape materials does matter. And I'm always going to want my rock layer to be the top, probably followed by some foliage layers and gravel and whichever things I think should take priority. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to add another layer. Call that one gravel. And I'm going to add another layer. And call this one heather. I'm then going to reorder my layers. So I'm going to grab this little kind of icon on the left here, and I'm going to drag the rock up to the top. And that's now switched the rock and the heather around. It doesn't insert the layers, it actually switches them. So this can be a little bit annoying. And if you have a big complex landscape material, you're going to need to reorder lots of stuff, or you decide you want to reorder lots of stuff, what you want to do is you want to open the project afresh, go to a blank level without the landscape loaded, and then do all of your layer rejigging. Because then instead of compiling every time you make a change, it's only going to compile when you actually open the level that's using the material. So I'm going to go into the heather layer, and I'm going to make this use the ML landscape basic. So I'm going to search basic here, and I'm going to make sure that I'm using the non-prototype version. You'll only have one at your end, but I've got a couple. And I'm going to do the same for the gravel. And notice there how the terrain has to compile every time I add a new layer. So I'm going to take my own advice, save, I'm going to close the material, And I'm just going to go to an empty level. So I've gone to an empty level in order that when I make the changes in the material instance, I no longer have to wait for the material to recompile. So I'm going to open that material up. And now I'm going to start adding in those blend assets. So right now you can see that we've got the layer asset hooked up. We don't have a blend asset. And if we have a look down here, you can see that we've got an MLB grass layer. So I'm just going to navigate to that by clicking the little search magnifying glass there. And that's going to take me to my existing layer blends. Now, there are a few different ways of setting up these layer blends, and it is totally possible to set up. I'll just jump into this rock layer for an example now. So right now you can see that we're getting we're kind of getting the material attributes, the custom UVs that we've plugged our landscape weights into, and then we're breaking out the specific channel we want. And it's totally possible to get customized UV1 and 2, get all of these layers, and then you can apply like a multiplying factor to them, like so. So we call this grass strength and rock strength. So we can multiply those like so, and we can then kind of add these together, or max them would probably be more appropriate. We can max these layers, and then that will be the way of determining, okay, which layer do we want this blend asset to actually like put on the landscape here, and you can have more than one. So the advantage of doing things this way is that you only need one blend asset to control like all of your blending. However, the downside of doing things this way is that if you want to have unique blending behavior per layer, which you often do, then you're going to need to go off and break that into a separate function anyway, or make this function very complex with lots of controls. And the second disadvantage is that when you do it this way and you sample both the grass and the rock layer weights, and you're kind of multiplying them. So the material's not actually smart enough to know that multiplying by 0 means don't use the layer. So visually, that means you're not going to see the influence of the layer on the landscape, but it's actually going to be it's going to kind of be adding all of the calculations for both the layers together, if that makes sense. So I'm not really a fan of doing things this way because it's not as optimized as having just the layer, just kind of pulling out the single layer that you want and feeding it through like so. Because when you do it like this, the material is smart enough to know that it shouldn't be doing the calculations for all of the other layers. So that's something worth bearing in mind. If you do it the way that I just showed and you don't do it this way, you're going to end up with a much, much higher instruction count on your shader. So I think this is simpler both in terms of workflow, understanding, and it's better for performance. But as we add more and more layers, we're going to end up with a whole library of these material layer blends, and it might get a little bit confusing which of these UV slots we actually want to pull out. So what are we going to do about that? Well, something that I like to do is I like to create a little material function that kind of handles this breaking out and just makes it a little bit easier for me to understand what's going on. So I'm just going to go back to the material instance here. We're going to go to the details panel. I'm going to open up that master material again. And here we can clearly see which layer is being fed into which UV slot. So actually, we've already kind of created the blueprints for ourselves here of what this function is going to look like. So I'm going to go and create a new folder called functions. I'm going to create a new material function, and I'm going to call that GetLandscapeLayers. Now, I'm going to open that up. And material functions allow you to create more than one output. So I'm just going to copy this output. I'm going to do it, let's say 6 times. I'm just going to go back into the master material and check how many we've got. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so we've only got 5 at the moment, but I'm going to anticipate that I might want more in the future. And then you see where we've got this set material attributes. Well, there's actually another really handy node called get material attributes. And what we're going to do is we're going to get the UV1. I'm going to get the UV2. I'm going to get the UV3. And we're just going to do the inverse of what we did in the master material here. So we're going to break out float2 components instead of make float components. And we're going to then hook those in to each of these slots like so. And lastly, we're going to name our outputs so it's easy to understand which they are. We're going to go back to our master material and just check the order. So it goes grass, rock, sediment, gravel, heather. Leave that for the time being. So we're only getting those layers. And finally, we need to add our function input, which is going to be material attributes input, because we want to pass all of the material attributes through. And then we've created a smart little function that we can put into our blend material, our blend layer. So we go back to our material layer blend rock. We can now actually just call this GetLandscapeLayers function. Now, if I right click and search GetLandscapeLayers, it is going to find it for me, but that's only because I've made a prototype. It's not going to find it for you. So what I need to do is I need to go into the function and make sure that it is exposed to the library there. And then go back to my blend layer, GetLandscapeLayers, layers, and here is the function. So now we can get rid of the get material attributes and the breakout float 2 components. We can pass the get landscape layers in from the top layer there, and now we just take the rock because this is the rock layer. And hopefully you can see the advantage of doing things this way, breaking that into a function. And there's another advantage too, which is when you work with functions and embed them into the blends here, even though you might have dozens of blends for different landscape layers, you can actually still make your workflow really nice and modular by putting repeated functionality into functions inside of the blends. So I really think this offers the best of both worlds there. So I now need to go and do that same process for all of the other blends that I've created. And I hope you can see that when you make a function like that and just copy your existing blend functions, even though you end up with a lot of different blend assets, it's very, very quick to go in. And the major advantage is that now we can stick whatever kind of additional blending functionality we want in after the landscape weights get sampled. And we will be doing that in a moment. So I navigate back to my material instance. And now I'm just going to make sure that I hook in the heather blend and the gravel blend. Now, it's worth pointing out that only when you reorder layers or add a new layer or set up the blend asset or change the layer asset, only those operations are going to cause the material to recompile. Changing the parameters, the textures, the scalar and the vector values, that's not going to cause a recompile. So now we can go back into our layer, into our map, and we can start modifying all the textures. And straight away, once you've opened up the level, you should see that you are getting the results of those distribution maps now represented on the terrain. And it already looks pretty cool. It's not, it's not done because we haven't set up the textures, but we can see those distribution maps are starting to look a lot more believable and nice. So time to move on to the texturing. So I'm going to open up that material instance since I closed it. And I'm going to navigate to where my textures are located in my content browser. So I've already gone ahead and imported those textures. There we go. You can see all of those textures that I have on disk here. I've just gone ahead and imported those into all of these folders. And now it just becomes a case of choosing the textures that I think are most appropriate for each layer. So the first one I'm going to add in is this kind of scree layer, this gravel. So I'm going to navigate to the scree that I downloaded. I'm going to change the size of this window here to make it a little bit easier. I don't care about what's in there, in that little 3D viewport. I only care about what's in the actual level. And I'm going to go to my gravel layer. I'm going to make the macro color and the macro normal editable. And I'm going to hook in the scree and the scree normal over there. And what's going on? And we can see that the gravel is in the 1, 2, 3, 4. So what I've done is I've connected the gravel up to that new make float 2 there, and really should have been in the second input of that make float 2. So I'm going to press Alt and left click to disconnect all of those and rehook that up the way it's supposed to be hooked up. And there you can see now we're getting that gravel kind of distributed in the correct location. And that's already starting to look pretty nice, in my opinion. All right, so let's just repeat that process for the other layers. So I want to change my rock material. I think that texture is actually all right, but I think it needs a normal map on the rock. Yeah, you can see the rock is there, but it's not super obvious at the moment. So let's go and hook in that rock. So what I did there is I just hit that magnifying glass to navigate to where the textures were. I'm going to hook up that rock. Okay, that's already starting to look a little nicer. And I'm actually going to go ahead and tint that rock to be a bit brighter so we can make it a little bit more clear. Maybe, yeah. And let's also go and change the mapping scale of the rock. I'm going to make it a bit higher, so it's going to tile more. So I don't really think that the rock's going to require a macro and a detail texture. So I'll probably make a separate layer to kind of handle just single layers like that don't have that don't need a macro mask. All right, so I'm going to bring up that tiling even more, and I'm kind of happy with that. Maybe bring that brightness back down. Let's leave it on 1 for the time being. Okay, so kind of just modified the rock there, and now we're going to go to the heather, and we can see that the heather is being distributed, but it doesn't have the right map. So it's going to hook up one of the heather textures I've got. So I'm going to kind of navigate to the highland grass like so. That's not where it is. There it is. So I've got a few different options for the heather, and I've got this heather very dark. I'm going to try. Let's try the heather very dark. So that's super bright green at the moment. I'm not overly worried about the color of these textures because we're going to do one last little kind of trick at the end here to kind of like bind everything together a little bit more. Okay. I'm going to go to the highland grass, and I'm going to look at my other grass options because I think that's a little bit washed out. I'm going to change the grass color. Okay. And I'll add in a normal map as well there. Okay, so starting to get somewhere. I might go and try one of the other options for the heather. You know what? I think I'm going to stick with that very dark one, but I'm going to do some additional tinting stuff. So I'm going to go into the tint there. I'm going to pull that more into kind of a reddy color. Maybe that's a bit too much. A little bit more of a brown. And I'm going to go into the sediment because we currently don't have a sediment layer hooked up. And I'm going to find, you know what, I don't have a dirt texture that I downloaded, so I'm just going to use that. I'm going to repurpose that scree again for the dirt as well. So you can see that kind of getting put into a few more areas, like those rivers here. And I'm just going to go ahead and tint that as well, kind of like make it a slightly more dirty kind of brown color. All right, so we've got our layers, and you probably would want to play with the textures a little bit more, maybe kind of tweak the amount of tiling that's going on. I'm going to change the heather to tile 20. And right now, the blend is just a straight up blend. Let's have a look at the rock especially. Maybe just turn the light around. I'll have a look there in a way that kind of shows us all of its faults. Let's go like that. So we've got our rock, and we've still got grass being scattered. So okay, I'm going to quickly hop back into the master material and just completely disconnect all that grass stuff. Okay, so I did finally actually disable that grass properly. And okay, so we can see that these maps are starting to look a lot nicer. But we were just taking a look at the blends, and you can see that the blend is kind of like quite faint, and we don't really have much control. Like if we go to the rock layer, for example, we go and see there's no parameters to kind of control how that blend looks. And if we were just using regular weight blended layers, that's what we would be stuck with. But because we're not using weight blended layers, we can actually do something a little bit more interesting. We can do something called a height blend. So I'm going to open up that rock layer, and now I'm just going to search for a function called Heightblending. Okay, there we go. And I'm going to take the output alpha because we're going to want to plug that into the blend material attributes there. And now we just need to determine what gets plugged into the Heightblending. And we know that this is the rock layer, so we're going to plug that into the transition phase. But we also have this option for a height texture and for contrast. So let's create a scalar parameter, call that contrast for the time being. And by default, that's 0, so we'll leave it on 0. And then we're going to take a look at this height texture input. So this height texture is going to be an additional texture that we can use to drive the blend. Now, we could just put a texture sample in with texture coordinates and kind of have scaling, you know, all of that kind of stuff, and then kind of set this to be a like a black and white mask, like a noise or like a displacement map. But this is another opportunity to kind of take advantage of this fancy layers setup. And we actually just want to pull out a displacement map from the layer that we're going to be blending in. So I'm going to do a get material attributes here, and I'm going to get a material attribute called opacity. Now, you might be thinking, opacity, why would we use opacity in a landscape material? It's going to be a completely opaque material. And you would be right. So we're never going to use the opacity in a landscape material. And that is why we can repurpose this channel to contain the kind of like the opacity blend texture from the layer that we're going to be, that we're setting up. So if we take out this opacity and plug that into the height texture there, we can go and save our rock layer now, our blend, sorry. And now we can go into the, we can go to into our landscape layer, ML Landscape Basic, and we just need to hook up that opacity map. So we're going to go to the set material attributes. We're going to set up the opacity there. So we have another input, and we're going to go down, see if we've got it already. We don't already have it set up. So we're just going to copy one of our texture samples. Let's go for the macro normal. And we're going to call this macro height. I'm going to plug in the macro mapping scale there to the UV. And we're going to go and change that default kind of texture to not be a base flatten normal map, to be a base flatten grayscale map. We're then going to take the red output there, plug that into the opacity. And it's worth bearing in mind that we could also add a world displacement or a world position offset at this stage and start to do some height offsetting as well. But I'm not very interested in that at the moment. I'm only interested in using the height map to drive the blend. So I'm now going to save. And I'm going to hop back into my material instance. And you're going to see now that all of our layers have this macro height control as well. So I'm going to go to the rock layer, and I'm going to navigate to the location of the textures. I'm going to find the displacement texture. I'm going to plug that in. And straight away, we're going to notice a slight difference, but it might be a little bit hard to put our finger on what it is. So let's just undo that change. And then hook that texture up again. All right, it is too hard to see the difference. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down to the blend settings now, and we're going to increase the contrast and see what happens. And you can see now that we're getting a much more sharply defined transition between the rock and the layers underneath. And crucially, it's also actually taking into account the height of the displacement texture. So in the kind of like more faded out regions of the transition region, so the weight map, it's going to be doing kind of like, it's going to be considering the shape of the height map. And we might want to add some additional extra controls to kind of influence that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the rock layer. And after the opacity, what we're going to do is we're just going to do an add here. So this is going to kind of provide us with the ability to offset the height. And now if we jump back into the material instance, and we go to that offset control, we start to play with it and see what happens. You see we now have the ability to kind of fade in and out that rock layer a little bit more according to the underlying height information. So I think a value of 0.5 is nice. You can see here how we get these kinds of portions of rock that are sticking through in a kind of much more like organic and natural fashion. So this is where that non-height blended, that height blended layer setting inside of the landscape settings. You see where we set it to be a no weight blend. That means a height blended layer. This is where that comes into practice, and we can start creating much more interesting and believable blends between our layers. And that's probably where I'm going to leave it for today with the textures. I might just go into the header and kind of tweak that color a little bit since it's quite dark at the moment. There we go. That's a little bit nicer. But you're going to notice that right now something's missing. It feels quite homogeneous. And there are a couple of factors at play here. The first one is that we don't really have enough layers here. So 5 is quite few landscape layers. So we probably want to go and bring in a few more. And the second and probably more important factor is that we don't have a global kind of like variation happening. We don't have color variation happening across the layers themselves. And this is going to be kind of the last magic trick that really helps to sell this environment, makes it look a ton better. But that's going to be the subject of the next video. So thanks a lot for watching. So we're not that far off now from this result. I know that this is looking quite different to the scene I just showed you, but that's largely down to the variation and some of the lighting settings. So we'll be getting to the lighting a bit later on, but in the next video, we'll be looking at how to introduce some of that color variation that you can see here. And you'll notice how that kind of blends together all of these layers just a little bit better than we see in the other example. So yeah, thanks again for watching. I hope that you found that useful. In my 1000 subscribers special video, I mentioned that anyone who wanted to could send me an email, get in touch, and kind of share their progress on a terrain that they're working on, and that I would offer to kind of provide some critique and some feedback on that. And someone's already reached out to me. So if I just switch over to here, and let's just go over to this email that I received from Daniel Moore. He has sent me a message, and he's hooked me up with some photos of his terrain. And I've already kind of sent him some feedback via email, but what I'd really like to do is to kind of take this environment onto a video and discuss it with him, or break it down on my own. So I'm just waiting to hear back from him on that, and hopefully soon I'll be able to provide a video where we maybe discuss some of the kind of improvements that he can make, and some of the interesting ideas that he's had, and great work that he's done here. You can see that this is already looking fantastic. So I'd really love to kind of break that down and discuss what went into making that with him. And yeah, that kind of goes for anyone else who's interested as well. If I get too many people who reach out to me, then obviously I won't be able to do them all. But I think we could do a fair number of these kind of breakdowns, something I'd really love to do. And I think there'll be a lot of value in that. So if you like what you see, if you're interested in seeing more, if you want to be a part of this then community that's growing, then like, subscribe, and maybe we can feature your landscape on the channel at some point. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.